welcome back to episode 2 to talking about awakening from the meaning crisis. So, in the last episode, we basically went through the basic what is the meaning crisis, what does it mean to be awakening, etc., etc. And then a few kind of terms, like psychotechnologies, which are basically rituals or tools or things like that. So ways ways almost like memes, you could even say. So memes would be like a psychotechnology, but it's basically just way of thinking of something or way of doing something that gives you like an affordance, right? We talked about shamans a little bit and all that kind of stuff. So if you want to know more about episode 1, I definitely recommend you check it out. So on to episode 2, right? So in this episode, we talk a little bit more about shamans, and we have a emphasis on flow. So the first part of this episode is all about flow. So basically, the case he's making for flow is pretty straightforward. It's kind of like there are things that you can do really, really well. You can do them so well that they'll become boring, right? And then there are things that are so difficult that to try and do them is just frustrating, right? It'll give you anxiety. And the idea of flow is when you're right in the middle of something, of your skill set, that you can get into a state of flow. So he gives an example of video games, right? So video games will tailor their difficulty to always keep you in that sweet spot to make it most likely that you'll get in flow, right? So they'll try to make it not be incredibly easy, right? And they'll try not to make it be so difficult that you're not really making any progress through the game, right? So they want you to be right in that sweet spot where you have to push yourself in order to progress. But if you push yourself, you always will progress, right? And then that can lead you into a flow state. And then he talks about how flow state is extremely pleasurable. I shouldn't say pleasurable actually. So he actually makes a point that it's not pleasure, right? So I should say it's extremely desirable. Like people will go out of their way to put themselves in it, but it is different than pleasure, right? It's its own thing that needs to be thought of as its own thing, but it is a very positive state, and it's a very important thing for people to have access to and be able to put themselves into. So I think for the most part, I think most people know about what flow is and what it feels like, and the gist of it, right? So I don't think we really need to go into it a huge amount, but it's important to note that you get into flow when it's fitted to your skill set, right? And also that it's all about insights, right? So it's all about like learning a skill or perceiving something new, right? So he goes into that you can get flow with insights, right? And he calls flow is like an insight cascade. So you're doing something, and then you're a little bit stuck, but then you get a little unstuck, right? And then the new challenge comes, and then again, right? You're a little bit stuck, but then you get unstuck, and then a little bit stuck, and you get unstuck. And these kind of insight cascades that will produce the flow state. And then he says that being in the flow state really helps you with your performance, that it really makes it something that you perform better at a task if you are able to get into the flow state. So as you're in the flow state, you're getting this insight cascade, you're getting better at whatever you're doing, right? And you can also pick up on implicit learning, right? So it's not just consciousness, right? It's something deeper than that, right? So you'll get a lot of intuition. So a lot of stuff is going on below consciousness that is making connections, right? And then he goes on a lot about basically just demonstrating this, where he'll show there's a lot of examples in a research environment where they'll test this or that, right? And people will be shown patterns, and and the game is to pick up on these patterns. But then as people pick up on the pattern, so they're able to do the game, you'll ask them what are the patterns? What are you actually picking up? And they'll just and And he says they'll either answer with they don't know, which is the right answer, right? Or they'll say, or they'll try to come up with a rule, but the rule actually won't predict what is going on, right? So I guess the takeaway from that is that they actually don't know uh, what is like what the rules are, even though that they can act out the rule. So that is like implicit learning. And he says it can go wrong, right? So he says, it's intuition when it's right and it's bias when it's wrong. And he gives some example of biases, but everybody knows what biases are, right? And of course, he also goes with correlation and not causation, right? So yeah, that's all pretty straightforward. And then he talks about implicit learning. With implicit learning, you need clear information and you need feedback to be tightly coupled and you need error to matter, right? So it has to make a difference. So that's interesting, right? So I think he's like setting up like the conditions that you'd actually want if you're kind of like trying to engineer a solution. So perhaps that's what he's setting up for, that when he's suggesting practices, it'll actually take into account this kind of stuff, clear information, tightly couple feedback, and error matters. And then he goes into like the power of metaphors, right? So if you ask people what are the rules that are allowing them to choose correctly, they will just make something up and it won't be right. But then he goes into metaphor. That metaphor perhaps is a way of talking about it where that's not necessarily. Then he talks about metaphor, where metaphor is a way of talking about something without necessarily having to give like strict causal links, right? And he talks about how deeply metaphor is embedded into everything, into our thought and our language, right? And he goes on examples where he basically demonstrates, that to even say a sentence that you're going to have to use metaphors for the most part, and most of our words are actually metaphors. And all these deep connections are coming from like insights that our culture has had. So instead of like trying to construct knowledge, like how you'd have to put it into a computer, it actually is constructed through metaphor, right? So we know what we know and we can flow in our knowledge the way we can because we're kind of in a sea of metaphors, which is all about linking, right? And not just with words, right? So he talks about things like, you can, make marks on bone that can that can symbolize the passage of time, right? So, and that's another way of like making connections between things that inherently wouldn't have connections. And then in the last part, he goes into like the Bronze Age, right? So he talks about the Bronze Age and how there was all these cities, but then there's the Bronze Age collapse and everything started. The major cultures like the Egyptian Empire, they go away for the most part, and then they're all a bunch of little cities, right? And then he talks about that perhaps what got us out of that is that there was writing before, but writing was very hard to learn and master. But what came out right after the Bronze Age collapse was like an alphabetic literature, right? And alphabetic literature is way easier to learn. So it's something you can kind of learn in your maybe in your youth or in your pastime, and then you can apply it to. Then you can go on with your like real job and then just apply literacy, right? Where in the like in the ancient world in the Bronze Age, literacy was so difficult that would have to be your job, right? It's so difficult to master that you really can't afford to just have it like a hobby. And then he talks about how like literacy in general really helps you do like second order thinking, so kind of like thinking about thinking, right? So you can write down what's in your mind and then you can read back what's in your mind almost like you're hearing it from someone else, right? So it can really help you get into yourself in a way where thinking on its own just wouldn't afford that, right? So when you're thinking in your mind, you're always kind of like taking your own perspective and you're kind of like wrapped up in the heat of the moment, so to say, right? But if you write something down and you come back to it the next day or maybe even the next year, like who knows, right? Then you can like get a view from your mind, almost like outside of your mind, right? And that's something that just thinking in your head either can't do, or at least it can't do very well. Yep. So that's basically the gist of what he goes over in episode 2. I guess my thoughts on it, it's interesting. I thought the flow state stuff was a little bit interesting, but I don't like see the point right now. Like the big aha, like why this is relevant. Like this all seems pretty obvious and pedestrian to me. So I'm sure it will, end up coming out to be something big and important. But right now, I just don't really get it. I thought that the point about metaphor was really interesting, though. So that one kind of hit home pretty a lot more than the idea of flow itself, right? Because with the idea of metaphor, I think that really breaks us out of kind of like a clear definition kind of view of knowledge, right? So if I say, well, I'm supervising something, it'd be like, what, you have supervision? Well, no, I don't really have supervision in the Superman kind of sense, right? Or in any kind of magical sense. But I have, I, if you're in leadership, you have a kind of vision, and it's above, just being on the ground. So in a sense, you do have supervision, right? But it's a certain kind of supervision. And but with metaphors, you kind of have to know what it means, and it doesn't actually mean what exactly what it says. But it's all about connections, right? It's making connections between categories, and it's in that kind of sense, right? So it's almost like a very strategic kind of like meaning making through like kind of like exaggeration, or I don't want to say lying, right? Lying is way too strong, but like going to like the opposite end, right? So it's like you're trying to see something and then you go all the way to the far end of it, right? So supervision, right? And then you just kind of let the context bring it back into sanity, right? So it's like, I have this God's eye vision. I'm, the master of the whatever the project. I see all. I know all. And then, well, sorry about that, everyone. My cord for my microphone came undone a little bit, so I actually hit it, and then it came out. So, oops. Well, what I was saying with supervision, I was saying like metaphor, like it almost feels like it's going to an extreme and then allowing the context to actually define the limits of the extreme, right? So you can say something like, I have supervision, and in this state of supervision, I have all this superior thoughts and powers, right? But then that, but then the statement as fact is so ridiculous that it almost invites to not be taken literally, right? And then in not being taken literally, it's the context that the statement is being made in that actually defines what's being talked about, right? So metaphor has this really wonderful way of talking both about the object and the subject in one word and just allowing the context to define both of them. So I thought the point on metaphor really hit home to me in a way that flow didn't. Maybe the problem is either maybe I'm on one side or the other of the flow, right? So I understand it so much that it's just boring to me, and I don't see why there's this big aha. Or maybe I'm so ignorant of the point he was trying to make that it's in kind of like the chaos side of it, but I'm just too, Dunning Kruger to actually realize that I'm missing the point altogether. So, but the point of metaphor definitely hit home. And then when he talks about the Bronze Age collapse, I thought that was interesting history. Yeah, just kind of set it up like the importance of insight and getting things right, and how even after being stable for thousands of years, it's only a matter of time till something comes to an end, right? If you don't have the right insights. And I thought alphabet literacy was a good example of psychotechnology, right? And how something new, even if it doesn't seem all that important, can really end up being important. As far as that, the alphabet literacy actually being able to do what he's claiming it's doing, like it brought us out of the Bronze Age collapse, and it helps with cognitive thinking. I don't know about that. Like, maybe. I'm a little skeptical. So I don't know. So the problem is being in the modern era or the modern age. I don't know too many people who are like legitimately not literate. And the people I do know are full of shit to a degree. It's hard to imagine that their literacy is really helping them out all that much. But maybe this is just like a limit in context, right? So I don't know. Who knows? So, but it's interesting, right? I take his point. So that was episode 2. I hope you enjoyed it. I thought, as far as, I guess I'll give a quick sum, is this episode 2 for Awakening from the Meaning Crisis was much more about just background stuff. And so we're still kind of working up to like making solid points. So I anticipate it will get better. So I hope you'd enjoyed it and take care, and I'll talk to you next time.